To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini. Before we get into the review, let's talk about the circumstances around this book because they're interesting. And I don't get to say that a whole lot about sci-fi fantasy publications. Usually it's just, this author puts something out, let's talk about it. But Paolini is a bit of a special case here because he was judging by the comment sections of the author interview I had with him, of our first foray into sci-fi fantasy. The Inheritance Cycle was a mega hit, well beyond the expectations anyone could have possibly had for it, selling numbers that were rarely seen during that time. It was unreal how much Paolini seemed to just knock it out of the park. But in the years since then, especially the last book, Inheritance's release, more and more people have come to criticize that work or defend it avidly. There's kind of a bit of a war online subtly happening about whether or not Inheritance holds up, or it's just kind of, it was fine, it's cute, it's a good introduction, but it's not much more beyond that. We're not going to get into that here. That's a conversation for another day, but we're here to focus on To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, Christopher Paolini's first major release outside of some short stories and things along those lines in 9 years. And many people are asking, has he just been resting on his laurels, or is he coming back swinging, showing us a new caliber the author can bring to the table? To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is trying to answer that question. And just look at this boy. This is almost 900 pages of sci-fi. This is a thick boy. This is a big boy right here. And I get the feeling he wouldn't be doing something as ambitious as releasing a tome like this that is the introduction to a new grand sci-fi universe called the Fractalverse if he wasn't trying to send a message to a lot of his biggest critics. So does To Sleep in a Sea of Stars nail the landing? Let's get into the review. I was sent this early because of the interview, but I was specifically told I cannot get into spoilers. So I'll do my best to set it up by just going off what I know is available in the marketing material and what's been said publicly before. To Sleep in a Sea of Stars follows a woman who is working in the greater space setting of the future. Like, okay, yes, it's sci-fi, humanity's out in the stars. Cool, already, I love that. I'm a big sucker for sci-fi, even like the most general concepts. And first contact is made, but it's not necessarily a positive thing. Now, already right away, many of Paolini's biggest critics are going to try and bring one of the Inheritance Cycle criticisms into this one here, but I don't think that's fair. Because Inheritance Cycle is often talked about as being a very unoriginal story. It's Star Wars is what everyone says. And Paolini has done some things here and pulled some ideas that have certainly been seen in sci-fi before. I could absolutely see someone going, hey, this is Halo, and oh, this is actually XCOM, blah, 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 blah. What those people fail to realize is that sci-fi as a whole is pretty much one of the most incestuous genres out there. It's been just retelling and reinterpreting the same ideas many times over for the better part of a century. I'm not saying there isn't original sci-fi, there certainly is, but many of the best stories are just pulling stuff that's been done again and an author going, here's my spin on it, or here's where I think that idea could go. This is actually an issue with science fiction that's probably worth a whole video of its own, where popular ideas in science result in the fiction that is written about science, so therefore you can have several books come out at the same time from different authors who are just inspired by the same material, so it seems like they're all vibing off each other. Sci-fi, because of its driving philosophy of being driven by speculation into the future of humanity, technology, all these things, can just have a lot of similar story elements, but what really matters and what I really want to drive home is the author going in a creative direction with those ideas that's bringing something to the table. That's actually something I really value in sci-fi because it's not really about the just core concepts, it's about the exploration of those concepts in an interesting way. And Paolini is certainly telling a different story with concepts we've seen before. So yeah, he's given ammo to many of the critics who are just going to try and bring that in. I just don't think it's necessarily as fair with sci-fi. Because, hey, if you're going to say, oh, he's just pulling from X, you need to realize that X is also probably pulling from like 4 other sci-fi tales. And you don't know where people are getting these ideas from. What's important is he doing something different? Is he telling a story that has some originality there? Yeah, I would say To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is a really interesting story on its own, and also does a pretty good job of introducing this Fractalverse. To Sleep in a Sea of Stars also gets a rather strange award from me here, where I'm gonna say, this is the most erased criticism I've ever had for a sci-fi fantasy story. I kept writing down criticisms like, oh, that kind of bugged me, and then Chris would address it or resolve it within the next like 5 to 10 pages very consistently. That happened so many times. So here's your weird ass award. I don't know how you did that. Get out of my head. But the lights behind me aren't that oh so bright blue. They're more of a purple because I do have some criticisms here, and let's go ahead and jump into those. This is a plot-driven story. The characters are fine. I actually found a couple of them to be rather interesting enough for real discussion, but this is first and foremost about the plot and the ideas being explored, which is pretty standard for science fiction. Like sci-fi has a reputation, especially in its older days, for not being super character focused, and I actually think that's more than alright. But a lot of Paolini's fans are going to come into this one expecting the same attention to detail and character development you've gotten previously from him, and I just don't think that's quite here because he's not focusing there. In addition to that, the pacing is jarring throughout. I think there's really wonderful sequences of high action, fast-paced greatness, but they often just clash into these dead stops of just, okay, that's over, and now we are having a slower portion, and it's very just bam, 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 bam. There's not really any kind of smooth, gradual transition, and it becomes just almost like whiplash. But right around the 400-page mark, this book hits the gas to the pedal and goes for quite some time. Then it stops once again, but then the final 50 to 100 pages, once again, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, blasts off with an extraordinary amount of force. The ending itself, though, that final, like, here is the post-climax rest bit, is going to be polarizing. Some people are going to really like some of the elements Chris brought in, some people are going to be bothered. There's one little like scene in particular to me that just read like, oh, this is a fantasy trope taking place in the sci-fi world here. It felt a bit jarring. It specifically revolves around gifts. It was a bit strange, but it was probably my least favorite sequence, but it could work and I could see how people would be a fan of it. But aside from that, I generally liked how this book finished out, and yeah, I was satisfied and excited for the next entry. There's also the fact that this is, as I said, nearly 900 pages. Closer to 8 if you take out the scientific papers at the back. And does it justify its page count? Recently in my Malice review, I specifically hit on the issue that many sci-fi fantasy authors seem to just not be able to censor themselves or edit themselves and just write and write and write and write and bloat and bloat and bloat their page counts when it's not needed to tell a story they're trying to tell. Paolini, not as guilty as that as most people. Believe it or not, for being as thick as this boy is, it mostly earns it. I think you could argue maybe up to 50 pages could be taken out, certain subplots that don't really pan out or lend to the grander narrative, or just sequences that are longer than they need to be. But overall, no, I wasn't particularly bothered by the page count. What's really surprising, shouldn't open it, this is not released yet, is that to me this read like two separate books. Not because of the page count, because it is actually structured like that. There is a build-up, setting, climax, payoff, post-climax. Oh, okay, then we're restarting in a whole separate one. It's not a criticism, really, but Paolini, in my opinion, has just put 2 books in one, so I guess that's a positive. You can read 2 books for the price of 1 here. Cool, but yeah, that's a thing. Outside of those criticisms, though, Paolini has definitely improved as an author. I don't see really any previous Paolini fans not being happy and excited by this entry. If you liked Inheritance, you still enjoy the author, unless for some reason you really hate science fiction, this is going to be another positive one for you. But that's not the big argument here, right? The big question is Paolini going to be able to win over many of his detractors and show great improvement? I think generally yes. There are a couple more weaker aspects. Some of the romantic dialogue around the beginning I found to be rather not smooth. I have a particular aversion to the word babe, and it's abused here. But aside from that, just the technical level of work that went into Sleep in a Sea of Stars is going to impress a lot of people. And yeah, I mentioned before, there are scientific explanations of so much in the back of this book, pages on pages, because he did his research. This isn't just some author who skims a wiki article about FTL travel and 3D printers and then just sloppily places them in their story. Paolini understands what these things are, their greater implications, and theorizes about how they could impact human life. Really well done, impressively so, and so I think he's going to win over many of the sci-fi fans just for that level of care, because a lot of us really appreciate that. His prose is still a bit clunky, especially towards the beginning. I don't know if I adjusted mentally to the way Christopher Paolini was writing, or he actually improved throughout the book, but I was a bit bothered by it at the beginning, but towards the latter, actually after just really the first third, I found myself just actually interpreting it as, oh, this is the super digestible prose style that's common now. That's by no means bad or lazy. He's writing perfectly fine, it's just very digestible, while also weaving in very interesting sci-fi concepts. I appreciated that because I feel like this is a very accessible sci-fi story to a grander market that isn't necessarily dumbed down in a way where those who are really fans of hard sci-fi are going to be turned off by it. The level of detail is extraordinary, and I don't mean in the Jordan sense of just like describing rooms and rooms and rooms. I'm talking about detail for the building of this universe setting. He's successfully gotten me more excited for the Fractalverse than I thought I would be. I will be coming back to more entries in this universe because I'm eager to see what he's going to do with it. And I'm pretty confident that with what he's executing here, Chris is going to develop a diehard group of fans who are frothing at the mouth for more Fractalverse entries. So did To Sleep in a Sea of Stars deliver? Is it going to convert many of the Paolini detractors while also satisfying his diehard fan base? Generally, yes. There's going to be people who still dislike it. It has flaws. It's not perfect. But in terms of launching the Fractalverse, showing many of his detractors what he's now capable of after polishing his craft for so long, and being an exciting sci-fi space opera on its own, I found To Sleep in a Sea of Stars to deliver. I actually have a really strong fondness for one particular delivery of theme Paolini did, where, I don't think this is spoilers, I think I'm safe to get into this here. He highlighted the childishness and the immaturity of humanity very well. Even though this is taking place hundreds of years in our future, there is still this, towards the end of the book, highlighting of the fact that humanity is immature. I don't mean in our development sense, I mean in our literal ego. Humans can be bratty, and I actually liked how he contrasted us in that way and highlighted many of the flaws within our own minds, our own ambition. Very well done. That was a great landing there. Overall though, how am I feeling about To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, and do I recommend it? Obviously, to Paolini fans, yes, 100%, check it out. And to those who have been naysayers of his or found themselves not as hot on the inheritance cycle as before, it's an almost 900-page commitment, so I'll leave it up to you. I am excited to see someone return after this time and put out a book I see a step up from where they were without ever actually thinking what they were putting out was bad. It's just a general improvement and a showcase of greater maturity as an author. Let's get into the ratings. For character development, I can't be too generous here. It's what I would say is slightly above average. I'm going to give it a 5.5 out of 10. There are a couple characters who definitely excel into the upper range and are people you could really be interested in, but with the high level of more cliche tropey characters and just the average work with them overall, I can't give it much more than that. The world building though is much stronger, and there are a lot of elements introduced and handled quite well. I'm going to go ahead and give it an 8 to 8.5 out of 10. Really enjoyed how well this universe scale world building, that's always like weird to say, right? Universe scale world, whatever, is executed well. I like it. Very impressive. The plot, stronger than most. Again, I'm going to give it a 8 out of 10. Quite nice. The really only other weak aspect here is the pacing, and while I did find certain just large chunks to be greatly, very well paced, it does then just hit this brick wall. And for pacing, I'm going to say a 6.5 out of 10, well above the average. Just has some issues. Prose, 6.5 out of 10 as well. Nothing here is sinking into below average, and pretty much the entire book rests between average to really good. And then, in a quite different rating that I have to bring in because what this is trying to set up, the broader Fractalverse, how well did it set up the Fractalverse out of 10? How well does To Sleep in a Sea of Stars introduce the ideas of a larger universe that can be written into to a reading audience? That's actually gonna be the highest rating. I think this did that extraordinarily well, and I'm gonna go ahead and slap a 9 out of 10 there. I never found it to be jarring or narrative breaking for what's going on. There's none of those like Thor in the cave scenes where you're like, we're only here because you're trying to set stuff up for different books. Very natural and well well put within the story here, while also building a universe broad enough that I absolutely want to return for the sequels for this direct storyline, to check out what's going on in completely unrelated stories within this universe. He built that boy. And overall, I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10. I had issues with this story in terms of some of its technical elements, but I'm really enjoying the ideas of the Fractalverse and what's being set up. That would be pumped up a little more there. But yes, I recommend people check this one out, and I am enjoying the new Christopher Paolini ambition. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace. And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to my latest high tier Patreons, Rebecca Vandervelde, I'm not sure, Zoe McGee, Orlong McLee, Scott Hawkins. I hope those were close to English.